Should companies be required to maintain a way to decrypt their communications, their customers' communications for law enforcement? Why don't we just go down the line? We'll start with you, Admiral, then Window, and then Kiran.
Depends on when you asked me that question. If you'd asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said absolutely. However, my views have evolved.
Absolutely, when you were the director of NSA and arguing for
the ability to have access under legitimate purposes with a warrant and so on. But the world has changed so dramatically as a result of the digital revolution. Now our way of life, our value, our wealth is all in digital form. And what I worry about is nation states who engage in economic espionage. Now I'm going to differentiate between normal espionage, you know, how many tanks, how many missiles, war plans. That's considered espionage that all nations would engage in at some level. But economic espionage is very different in that you're after source code or intellectual capital or results of research and development and so on. Because that is such a significant, such a significant level in this country, it is a strategic imperative. So when I weigh the benefit from having law enforcement access to communications of a potential criminal or whatever, that would be a good thing, and I'm in favor of it. However, if going to ubiquitous encryption allows us to secure databases and communications broadly of business and citizens to protect not only privacy but intellectual capital, source code and so on, I think that benefit outweighs the more narrow benefit of law enforcement access.
Thank you. Window, what's your perspective on this?
Similarly, when you try to create a mechanism to allow access, lawful access, you undermine the core integrity of the crypto system. And if you can't rely on the security of your system, then you're going to move to one that you can. So even if we force technology companies in the US to create backdoors for lawful access, then the folks who need to secure their communications or want to secure the communications, whether they're terrorists or murderers or who knows what, right? Those folks are going to be able to move to technologies that don't have broken crypto, and those will always be available. So if US companies can't build them, then foreign companies will build them. And if foreign companies can't build them, then it'll always be available from the community. We can always build a new implementation because there are crypto libraries out there that will allow you to easily, quickly build a new implementation. And if you don't have access to those libraries, the math is going to be impossible to pull out of public knowledge. So we can always build the new crypto libraries. We can always use those crypto libraries to build a new implementation that allows end-to-end encryption. So even if we wanted to pull this out of, if we wanted to pull strong, unadulterated crypto out of the marketplace, there's always going to be another provider out there who can build it easily and make it available. So the benefit to law enforcement is going to be small and short-lived, and the cost to American enterprise is going to be significant.
What do you think, Kiran? Why don't you address the point that...
Sure, and I think it's helpful maybe to provide a little bit more context, because when we think about, and we sort of call this the going dark problem, it's the government's inability to obtain critical information in electronic form, even though we have lawful process, so for example, court authorization to do so. So that is actually broader than just the encryption issue. So for example, it would cover situations where we go to a company with a court order and they're unable to technically segregate the information, even if it's actually in plain text, even if they had the information in plain text. So that's actually separate and apart from encryption, but it's all part of the broader going dark issue. But specifically, even on encryption, I think we have to differentiate. We sort of talk about this in a couple of different buckets. One is sort of the data in motion problem. So that is encrypted communications like messaging, video conferencing, things of that nature. Yeah, exactly. And then data at rest, that's data that sits in a device or is on a cloud or things of that nature. And so, you know, I don't think we think there's one size fits all solution to this problem. There are probably multiple different solutions to this problem. And one of the things that we've been having, I think, very productive discussions with companies and Congress and industry groups is, you know, we all share the same values, right? We care about national security. Like the people who run these companies, they care about national security. They care about public safety. They care about privacy. They care about civil liberties, and we do too. And so the question is, how do we maximize those values, right? What solutions do we have to maximize? And I don't think there's a silver bullet out there, which in many ways, frankly, differentiates this from what was going on in the 90s, because there was one particular government solution in the 90s, and that was the Clipper chip. And that one, there was the idea that the government would hold certain encryption keys, and no one is advocating for that position now. And so I think it's important to keep that in context.
So, Kiran, are you saying that right now you don't believe that the government should require in any way, through a legislative mandate, for instance, that companies actually maintain a way to decrypt communications for them?
So I think that the Deputy Attorney General and the Director of the FBI answered a very similar question at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing back in July, which is to say, there isn't a silver bullet here. We don't think there's a one-size-fits-all, but there's been no decision made on whether to seek legislation or not. And again, I think it's important to emphasize that we're having these productive discussions because people share the values. They see the problems that as law enforcement we're dealing with. And the other piece here is it's not just the federal level. I mean, at the state level, you're hearing from District Attorney Vance, Dan Connolly, both of them testified before Congress. Dan Connolly's the DA over in Boston, and Vance is the DA in New York, that they're having real problems with their investigations and their prosecutions. And so it's an issue for all of law enforcement. And again, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution.
What about the other option? Should the president publicly, explicitly reject a legislative mandate on companies? I mean, some argue it might even encourage more firms to voluntarily cooperate. If you could each answer really quickly. Mike?
I don't know that I advise the president to take that position. I think it needs to play out a little bit more, but let me just put it in context. We had law enforcement activities before we had telephones. It worked fairly well. When telephones came along, we had to adjust to telephones, and so we learned how to tap, and we set up laws, and we had a process for doing that. Now, I'm a little older than most of you in the room, and I'm going to use a historical context here. World War II, we were breaking, in cooperation with the British, we were breaking Nazi Germany code and reading it before the German field commanders. Broke their code. Phenomenal capability. We were very successful. Now, I'm a product of the Cold War. We were very successful. We didn't break a lot of code. Good code can't be broken. Got to run it to exhaustion, measure it in billions of years. But did we do good work? We did fantastic work. Now, as a director of NSA, I was convinced, absolutely convinced, if we relax export controls on encryption and we allow public key encryption to run at the loose, and it'll spread around the world and we'll go deaf. And so we mounted an argument for submitting the Clipper chip idea and getting it approved, and we were totally rejected. I look back on that and says that was the right decision. Because guess what? The old agency I used to be responsible for, had the privilege of leading, is doing better signals intelligence than any time in its history. So what I would argue with law enforcement is you are where you are now as a product of your current experience. You will adapt if there is ubiquitous encryption, not only of data in motion, but data at rest, and we can really secure these databases for the benefit of business and privacy, then law enforcement will have to adapt to that, and there are ways to adapt to it. Everyone out there, I would bet that at 99% level is carrying a computer on your body at this time. That computer is providing lots of information about you, whether you know it or not. So if law enforcement starts to change the way they think about this, I think there are many, many ways to carry out the mission, given that you are faced with a situation where technology is not going to be reversed. There is a crying need for this kind of data protection in motion or at rest to protect the economic interests of the country.
Kiran, I have to have you respond to.
Sure. So I think we certainly agree that we need to ensure that the data in motion and data in rest is secure. I mean, we are on the front lines of a lot of the cyber thefts, cyber crimes, and so that is something that we do support strong encryption. And that's actually partly why we're having this discussion, really, to Admiral McConnell's point, is that we want people to understand that the tools that we have today, that the American people have given us through Congress, like the Wiretap Act and such tools like that, Rule 41 search warrants, are not working the way you might think they are today. And so, I guess that's the one point. The other point, too, is that we do want to have these discussions with technology companies almost precisely for that reason, because we're in this together. And so we need to figure out, how do we do both? How do we maximize the security of these systems, but also allow law enforcement to get access pursuant to a court order, to obtain the information we need to when we have a court order? And we see, just if we look empirically throughout the industry today, we see companies who are able to do this balance, to have systems that are secure, that they use encryption, but for their own business purposes, they're able to access the content, whether it's for data security, right, for scanning for malware, for spam, things of that nature, or also for their own business purposes, like providing targeted advertisements or things like that. We also see this in the corporate world as well, where corporations have been able to balance these competing issues. So for example, the classic case is, if you leave your laptop in a taxi, you want to make sure it's strongly encrypted so that somebody who gets your laptop isn't able to break in and get the sensitive information. And so corporations, when they give their laptops to employees, they're secure, they're encrypted using strong encryption. But those same laptops, the corporation maintains an ability to access it, whether it's for data backup purposes, for data recovery. If something were to happen to the employee, the company wants to ensure that they can get the important data. And so, there's just mechanisms that companies have. And so, that's what part of this discussion is about, is how do we do this balance? We want to rely on the innovation, frankly, of our industry and our companies, because we see that they've been able to at least do some type of balancing for their own business purposes today.
So Window, as the technologist here, what do you think? Is a system in which a company holds the key or can read emails in the clear, such as Google Mail or Yahoo Mail, is that really strong encryption? And can there be a system of strong encryption that still offers a way to give law enforcement access?
So
respond to
it's strong encryption in transit, but whether or not it's secure is a different question, right? So it might be secure in transit against folks who might be listening on the wire, but once it's on the server, it's vulnerable if it's
You're talking about
not encrypted on the
examples of like
server.
Google Mail or Yahoo Mail.
Yeah, well, even Yahoo Mail, the CSO of Yahoo at the time, Alex Stamos, was working on end-to-end encryption, announced in March of 2015 that was something they were going to deliver by the end of the year, which is fantastic, because end-to-end encryption means that when I create a message for you, I encrypt it on my device, and I send it to you encrypted through Yahoo servers, Google servers, whoever. And it's completely encrypted and unreadable until it gets to your device, where your key unlocks it, which means that I have access to it, you have access to it, and nobody else has access to it. That's a different kind of system. So that is secure in that it's available to the parties for which it's intended, and to no one else. Google's model is different, and Yahoo's.
Or the models that Kiran was referring to, the corporate model of holding a key, or.
So those models are different in that they intend to actually analyze those emails so that they can present targeted ads to you. So because Google is an ad company, they're going to choose security mechanisms that fundamentally support that model. This is not about whether or not it's supporting user security to create a system that allows me to have access to it and the party that I'm sending it to have access to it, because it's part of their business model for Google to also have access to it. That's a different sort of system.
And it's less secure, is what you're saying.
It's secure against some threats and not against others. It's available to Google, and Google's not one of the parties I'm intending to communicate with. And so as far as I'm concerned, that's not secure for my needs for some things. If I'm sharing pictures of my son with my father-in-law, it's great for that.
So Kiran, you and other government officials have, and you pointed out again, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, right? And last month, FBI Director Comey said he doesn't think companies have really tried to come up with solutions for their own platforms. What do you think? What makes you think that if companies really try, they can come up with a solution? I mean, apart from the examples you mentioned of the commercial email providers where they want to serve ads, or the corporate example. Do you know of any examples where a company has, with some prodding, come up with a solution?
Well, I think we talked about a few of them here, just empirically what we see today in the private sector or in the corporate world or certain consumer-based companies. But I would say to your sort of broader question is why do we think it's possible is because we have the most innovative tech company in the world, right? With tech industry in the world. So I think, if someone's going to solve the problem, it's going to be the folks in that industry.
Well, Admiral, the NSA, we're told, has the most skilled mathematicians in the world. Do you think it can devise a solution that would ensure strong encryption while still allowing a way to decrypt communications for law enforcement?
If we could achieve an ability to secure communications and secure data at rest in file-on servers and so on, protecting intellectual capital, that'd be a wonderful thing. If there was a way to do all of this, it would be an even better solution. The position I've tried to take on this is, if you paint a story that we've heard many times from the law enforcement side of it, that there's a kidnapped child and the only way you're going to rescue it is to have access to communication. That's a very emotional, tugs at the strings of your heart kind of story. And I sympathize with it and so on, but you can't make national policy decisions on one isolated case, given the intellectual property of the nation is being taken at the terabit level every day. We're an innovative, creative nation. That's our future, and when that's taken away from us, that's a major strategic problem. So would I like to see a solution that allows us to have integrity in the communications, security in the communications, security in the stored data, and achieve all these goals, and provide for legitimate access under court order? Sure. And can it be achieved? Maybe. MIT's taken a position that you can't get there from here. Report they issued, I think last May, June, that they thought it would complicate the technology. Now, if you're an advocate for it in industry, you grab the MIT report and weigh it around and say, see, one of the best institutions in the nation says it can't be done. I don't believe it can't be done, but I believe the debate needs to be made weighing the efficacy of both sides of this argument. If I have to trade one for the other, I would take ubiquitous encryption of communications in motion and at rest, if I had to trade one for the other. I would prefer to have both.
Kiran, if you had to take one or the other, which would you take?
So I think, as the analyst pointed out, like this is a balance, and I don't think we're at that point yet. I mean, I think really that's sort of the big point from our perspective is that it is a balance, but we need to try. We need to see what's possible. And it isn't, again, the one size fits all, which I think if we look at a lot of the public debate, it's, well, you can't do it because you're going to mandate some type of solution. And no one is advocating for that. It is really targeted for, a particular company that knows its own systems, knows its own products. What can that company do? Right? How does that company do this balance? So it's really a lot of little micro type innovations for particular companies. And that's in part why we say there's no one size fits all. What works for one company over here might not work for another company over here. And that's why I think there's some sort of disconnect on the debate.
I just want to make a point here. But again, I mentioned being old. I've watched this for a long time. Let's ask ourselves the question, why does the internet work? The internet works because it's free. We get benefit of email and connections and so on. Largely, it's free. Well, why does it work for business if it's free? Because it's a surveillance network. Now, if you go back to an ARPA, at those days, now DARPA, Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency, invented this protocol to allow it to happen. Who was against it? Corporate America, particularly the service providers, AT&T and what's now Verizon, absolutely against it. Because a bureaucracy, whatever it is and whatever its interests are, it tends to define reality in its own self-interest. The reason I'm going back in history here is, don't get in the way of progress. Don't get in the way of innovation and creativity, because this is going to happen. As Window made the point, somebody's going to provide this encryption. So that's going to set up a very interesting debate and dilemma for those who would use it in this country if it's foreign made, and what happens when China shows up with a warrant for information access to the database of a Chinese citizen on the U.S. side. So this, many complications here. And so I'm advocating informed debate. We'll see how it turns out, but don't get in the way of the progress of technology. And don't be persuaded by one argument that we're going to solve a criminal case or dozens versus what's happening to us economically from economic espionage.
Mm-hmm. Window, did you want?
When it comes to end-to-end encryption, the communications should be available to the party that is creating the message, the intended recipient, and no one else. If you create a mechanism in there to allow any other party to have access to it, then you've fundamentally undermined the security of that system. And it doesn't actually matter who that third party is or how well they promise to protect that access. The system is undermined, and you can't trust it any longer. And at that point, you should choose a system that offers true security.
Okay.
Can
Yep.
just, not to be obstreperous here, but we're talking about secret key encryption and public key encryption. Secret key has been around for over 100 years, and all nation states use it. And as the director of NSA, who makes the key cards to protect classified information? NSA does. That's the other part of their mission. So it can be done. We've done it for 100 years, where you distribute the key cards. It's done electronically now. So you can't. This is a manageable system in the context of secret key. When you go to public key, which is currently driving this debate, it's a little different dimension. So rather than say it can't be done, I'd rather say it's difficult. But can you imagine having this discussion with some technologists in 1970 about where we would be today, about having the kinds of iPhones and Androids and internet service and global connectivity and so on? I sat in my office in a business context. My partner was in Japan. He asked me a question. I answered it. He gave me his response, and I answered that. It happened in less than 2 minutes, and we were half a world apart. That's fundamentally changed how the world operates. So let's don't say it's impossible, but let's don't get in the way of technology effort either.
I don't think this is going to change in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. If Alice sends a message to Bob, then the message should be available to Alice and Bob and not Charlie third party. That's it.
If Alice is a terrorist, I would take issue with your comment. Maybe there's an interest if they're going to blow up the World Trade Center. That might be cause you to have a little different perspective.
That's a good reason to want it, but fundamentally, the parties that are intended to have the communication should have access to the communication, and anyone else outside of that. If it's available to anyone else, then the system is insecure.
Well, we've done it for 100 years. I just
I'd like
make that point.
All right. I'd like to ask Kiran one question about sort of an emerging trend, which is that some end-to-end encryption applications, such as Signal platform, are being developed by open source collectives of developers who are spread out across the world and do not have a corporate headquarters on which you can serve an order. So how does the DOJ, Department of Justice, deal with such a situation?
Yeah, I guess maybe the broader question you're asking, Ellen, which goes to something that was said a little bit earlier, is, this stuff there always will be a mechanism for some type of end-to-end encryption or some type of system where even with a lawful court order, we're not going to be able to get access to it. And I think one way of thinking about it, and the director sort of used an analogy that he uses, it's different haystacks, right? If the size of your haystack is the entire country and millions of devices and billions of messages a day, that is a different problem than if it's several sophisticated actors who are using certain types of platforms that they've built on their own or they're otherwise through some type of open source model. And they're just different problems. So I think it would just be, and with different problems, you bring different resources to bear. So it's just a different situation.
And what about the point that the Admiral, and I've heard others make, is that in the end, law enforcement will find a way to make its case. You might not get the communication you want, but you can use other, maybe more traditional means of surveillance to still make your case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on that one, The example I like, well, first of all, I mean, again, at the state and locals, right, they're saying there is no other information, at least that's some of the testimony, that they need to get access to devices because for the type of crimes that they investigate and prosecute, that's where the evidence of the crime would be. But more broadly, like when we talk about court orders and wiretap orders, for example, it's a very resource intensive for us to get those orders, not only from the agent's perspective and the prosecutors, but also the review at Main Justice. But even more importantly, even more than the probable cause that we have to show that the person is engaged in a criminal activity for a federal felony, is we also have to show that other investigative techniques have failed. Right? And those could include physical surveillance, trash searches, undercovers, informants, but also pen registers and toll records, which is a form of metadata. Right? And so someone has to show that was tried and failed and was not sufficient. And that's why we need to get the content of communication. And that's important for a whole range of investigations that the department does, from fraud to drug violence to organized crime. And so, at least under the current laws that we have and authority we have to get that, I think the point that we're trying to make is we're having problems with using those authorities to the fullest extent that Congress and the American people have given us to investigate and prosecute these crimes.
Well, how significant really is the problem for you today? What percentage of cases do you find where you're thwarted because of encryption, whether it's for data in motion or data at rest?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ellen. And again, as I said, I think electronic information more generally is part of almost everything that we do today, because information that used to be kept in filing cabinets is no longer being kept there, and everything's really electronic these days. In terms of hard data, it's a hard question to answer, in part because our investigators and our prosecutors, they don't just stop when they hit a brick wall. They try to get around it, and they try to figure out how else can they investigate the particular crimes or prosecute the individuals, what other evidence is there. And we just haven't had good statistics and good data about that. And that's something that we are trying to do more of today, to capture those moments, right? Capture the times when somebody isn't going to go through that laborious and resource-intensive process that I mentioned about the Wiretap Act court orders, because they know at the end of the day the system is, the company won't be able to respond. So we're trying to track that better, to get better data, and I know that's something that we want to do as quickly as possible.
Make one last point.
Yes, and then we are wrapping up.
I'll just make a last point, if I may. If we had ubiquitous encryption, data in motion, data at rest, and law enforcement had a situation where they had to deal with it, you may have to think creatively, maybe get a court order to tamper with the device that the subject uses to make it vulnerable.
You mean hacking the endpoint? To hack?
Endpoint, I mean, you can think about this a lot of different ways, but the point I'm trying to make is, given that you face a new situation, you will devise, my belief is that law enforcement would devise new techniques. And you can always manipulate an electronic device to make it serve your needs if it happened to be to collect the information externally. That's probably something that the FBI, I don't know, but I'm assuming they haven't thought about. But if faced with that situation, that's one path. There are probably many other paths that would allow you to get the same information for
What do you think of the advisability
purpose.
of that, Kiran, getting the information right off the endpoint?
Yeah, I mean,
through software updates.
I'm not sure I talk about sort of specific techniques, but that general thought, I think that also came up in the Senate Judiciary Committee meeting, and one of the points I think was made there is that those situations it's not really a timely solution, nor is it really scalable in many cases, and and so I see we're out of time, but I think.
Do we have any questions? Sorry. No? Okay, so I'd just like to ask each of you for a final question. Then we sort of got at it earlier, but it's an opportunity to really home in on it. What should be the top priority guiding this debate then? Is it strategic cybersecurity, say preventing Chinese economic espionage in cyberspace, economic competitiveness, which is an issue which we didn't really have time to delve into here, but or public safety and national security?
I think the first two are the same. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a single choice, my choice would be the first. I think we could
strategic cybersecurity.
Strategic cybersecurity to ensure economic competitiveness of the country, because that's the issue I'm trying to highlight. So if that's my choice, I'm going to choose the first. I would like to see us have both if it's possible.
I agree that the first two are both served by strong, unadulterated crypto, available to enterprise and available to all of us. I think the last can be achieved through other mechanisms, as you pointed out, and requires a little bit more creativity, but even if the communications are harder to grab because of secure end-to-end encryption, it doesn't mean that they are completely without resources.
Okay.
I think we just have to have an informed and honest discussion about how we maximize those values, all of them, right? How we maximize cybersecurity, ability of protecting public safety, national security, and also the privacy and civil liberties interests.
So decide what level of trade-offs we can live with and accept in each of those. That's basically.
The GAO report just out says on the federal side, it's worse than ever. It's gone up over 1,000% in 5 years. And if you can start with the OPM breach and so on, I mean, that information is extremely valuable and it's vulnerable. So we really need to secure these databases. That is, I would argue, a higher public good if they're secured appropriately.